My father-in-law slid the divorce papers across the table halfway through Thanksgiving dinner, convinced he had sealed every exit. My husband refused to look up. By the fireplace, another woman smiled, as if my seat was already hers. Not one person in this room realized that the property in my name was their true target. They also didn't know the envelope in my best friend's purse was about to burn their entire charade to ashes long before dessert arrived. I am Ella Perez. I am 34 years old. The moment I crossed the threshold of the Bellamy estate in the affluent suburbs of Charlotte, the heavy, suffocating weight of the evening settled firmly onto my chest. I wore a tailored wine-colored dress, chosen specifically because it felt like a suit of armor. This was supposed to be a traditional Thanksgiving, a time for gratitude and family warmth, but the air in the grand, vaulted foyer was entirely devoid of any such feeling. I had spent 4 years navigating the chilled, marble-floored halls of this family, learning to read their subtle cues and silent judgments. But tonight was undeniably different. A cold, sharp tension hummed beneath the classical music playing softly from the hidden speakers. It felt less like a holiday gathering and more like a tribunal waiting for the accused to arrive. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of stifling luxury. The long mahogany table, which could easily seat 20 people, was set with an almost aggressive perfection. Crystal glasses gleamed like sharp ice under the chandelier, and the heavy silver cutlery was aligned to the exact millimeter. But it was the guest list that made my stomach tighten into a hard knot. This was not the usual gathering of gossiping aunts and retired uncles. Mixed among the immediate blood relatives were Bellamy Redevelopment Group's senior corporate partners, the family's notoriously aggressive real estate lawyers, and a handful of wealthy acquaintances whose presence made absolutely no sense for an intimate holiday dinner. I was not informed about any of them. No one had mentioned that we would be breaking bread with the legal team. They were dressed in dark, sharp suits, sitting rigidly in their high-backed chairs like vultures waiting for a signal. Adrian, my husband, stood near the dark oak bar pouring himself a scotch. He looked as effortlessly elegant as the day I met him, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders. But his silence was a heavy, living thing in the room. From the moment our Blacktown car passed through the wrought iron gates of the estate, he had completely shut down. He refused to look at me, whenever I intentionally caught his eye. He quickly shifted his gaze to the patterned rug on the floor, his jaw tight. He nursed his amber drink as if he were bracing for a massive physical impact he knew he could not stop, yet lacked the courage to warn me about. His cowardice was palpable, radiating off him in waves. Then there was Warren Bellamy, the patriarch, the man who built the Bellamy redevelopment empire out of ruthless commercial acquisitions and sheer, unyielding willpower. He stood at the head of the grand room, not like a warm father hosting a Thanksgiving feast, but exactly like a chief executive officer preparing to close a hostile corporate takeover. His posture was brutally rigid, his smile cold and calculated. Beside him fluttered Celeste, my mother-in-law. Her maternal sweetness tonight was a grotesque theatrical performance. She moved around the room with a manic, nervous sort of grace, constantly adjusting a linen napkin here, shifting a red wineglass a fraction of an inch there. She gently, but firmly, corrected a younger cousin's posture. She was setting a stage. Every movement was a rehearsal for a play I had not been given the script for. She wanted the aesthetics of the destruction to be flawless. The final piece of their elaborate trap revealed itself near the grand stone fireplace at the far end of the room. A striking blonde woman in a fitted ivory dress stood holding a crystal champagne flute. I had never seen her before in my life. When Celeste finally noticed my unblinking stare, she glided over and placed a cold, heavily jeweled hand on my bare arm. "Ella, darling," Celeste said, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary warmth. "This is Caroline. She is an old friend of the family. We are so thrilled she could join us tonight." An old friend of the family. The phrase was deliberately vague, but the intention behind it was crystal clear. It was a calculated, deliberate insult designed to throw me off balance. Caroline offered a soft, knowing, almost pitying smile that told me exactly why she was wearing ivory, a color strictly reserved for brides and replacements. She was the understudy, fully dressed and waiting in the wings for the leading lady to be pushed off the stage. Dinner proceeded like a slow march toward a public execution, course after course of rich, heavy food was served by invisible catering staff. But I barely tasted the roasted turkey or the truffled potatoes. The conversations around the table were hollow and meaningless, echoing sharply against the high, vaulted ceilings. I counted the minutes in my head. 1 hour, 2 hours. I watched Adrian drink his expensive wine, his knuckles bone white around the fragile stem of the glass. He never spoke a single word to me. He chewed his food mechanically, a man completely detached from the betrayal he was helping to orchestrate, just as the porcelain plates from the main course were being quietly cleared away. Warren tapped his heavy silver fork against his crystal water glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the dining room like a butcher's blade. Every conversation died instantly. All eyes snapped to the head of the table. Warren stood slowly, taking his time to button his tailored suit jacket. He raised his half-full glass of dark red wine. "Thanksgiving is a time for serious reflection," Warren began, his voice booming with practiced, corporate authority. "It is a time to look closely at what we have built, to consider our legacy. The Bellamy bloodline has always been about strength. It has always been about making the absolute necessary decisions to protect the long-term future of this family. No matter how difficult or unpleasant those decisions might seem in the present moment." He did not look at his son. He looked directly and unwaveringly at me. Warren reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded, legal-sized papers, even from a distance. The blue ink of a notary public stamp was clearly visible on the bottom corner of the final page. He placed the heavy document flat on the polished mahogany wood and pushed it deliberately down the length of the table. It slid over the smooth surface and stopped precisely in front of my empty dinner plate. Divorce papers. A suffocating, absolute silence fell over the massive dining room. But as I looked around the long table, looking at the sharp lawyers, at the greedy business partners, at Caroline in her triumphant ivory dress, and finally at Celeste and my silent husband, Adrian, I realized the horrifying truth. This was not the sudden silence of shock. No one gasped in surprise. No one whispered to their neighbor in confusion. It was the heavy, breathless silence of pure anticipation. Every single person in this room, right down to the corporate attorneys who had just eaten our roasted turkey, knew exactly what was about to happen. I was the only one kept in the dark. I was the mark, and they were all waiting to watch me bleed. They fully expected tears. They expected a dramatic, hysterical scene. They expected me to scream at Adrian, to throw my glass of wine against the wall, to crumble completely under the sheer, crushing weight of their collective betrayal. They wanted me to break so they could justify their cruelty. I did none of those things. I reached out, my hands perfectly steady and cold, and picked up the thick stack of paper. I felt the heavy weight of it, the coarse, expensive texture of the legal stock against my fingertips. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. Instead, I opened the stiff cover page and began to read the first paragraph. I read every single word with excruciating slowness, letting the agonizing silence stretch out until it transformed from their weapon into my own. Exactly 3 seats away from me sat Marisol Kane. She was my oldest and best friend, the only person from my actual life I had invited to this wretched dinner, while the entire Bellamy family held their collective breath, waiting for my inevitable emotional breakdown. I casually glanced over the top edge of the divorce decree. Marisol caught my eye. She did not look panicked. She did not look surprised. She simply shifted her weight in her antique chair, resting her manicured hand lightly against the side of her dark leather designer purse. Tucked safely inside the silk lining of that bag was a thick, heavy envelope of our own. Let Warren have his grand, pompous speech. Let Caroline wear her insulting ivory dress. Let Adrian stare pathetically at the floorboards. They thought they had successfully backed me up against the edge of a steep cliff with nowhere left to run. They had absolutely no idea the ground they were standing so proudly on was about to give way entirely. I was exactly 30 years old when Adrian Bellamy first walked into my life, bringing with him an illusion so perfectly crafted that it took me 4 entire years to dismantle it. We met at an exclusive, high society art fundraiser in Uptown Charlotte, a glittering event filled with the kind of old money and inherited privilege that I had spent my entire adult life actively avoiding. At that time, I was the director of operations at Northvale Analytics. My entire existence was built on cold, quantifiable data, relentless 60-hour work weeks, and the fierce independence of a woman who had paid her own way through every single milestone. I did not have a trust fund. I did not have a safety net woven from influential relatives. Everything I had, I built with my own 2 hands. When I saw Adrian standing near the abstract exhibits, he did not possess the loud, abrasive arrogance of the wealthy men I usually encountered at these corporate functions. He seemed entirely removed from the opulent chaos around him. He held his drink with a loose, careless grip, his shoulders slightly slumped as if he carried an invisible, crushing weight. When he finally approached me, his approach was remarkably gentle. He did not boast about his family's sprawling real estate empire or his sports cars. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, self-deprecating exhaustion about the suffocating pressures of his lineage. He painted a masterful portrait of a man desperately tired of the ruthless expectations thrust upon him by his father. He made me feel like an anchor in his storm. He made me believe, with every softly spoken word, that he was the absolute antithesis of the cold, calculating world he was born into. His pursuit of me over the next 6 months was an exercise in flawless, understated romance. There were no extravagant, overwhelming gestures meant to buy my affection. He chose quiet, dimly lit corners of independent coffee shops over Michelin-starred restaurants. He listened to my frustrations about supply chain logistics and data integration with genuine, unwavering attention. I fell in love with a man I thought was trying to escape his own shadow. But the subtle, insidious signs of the reality I was stepping into began to surface the very first time he brought me to the Bellamy estate for a Sunday afternoon introduction. His family was impeccably polite, wrapping their inherent hostility in layers of southern charm and expensive velvet. They did not attack my background. They simply dissected it with surgical precision under the guise of polite curiosity. "Adrian tells us you have done remarkably well for yourself, Ella," Celeste had said, pouring tea from a heavy silver pot. "It is so incredibly brave for a young woman to navigate the corporate world without any family connections or established social networks to rely on. Your parents must be so relieved that you managed to secure such a stable position." It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive humiliation. They asked seemingly harmless questions about the public university I attended, the modest neighborhood I grew up in, and my distinct lack of country club affiliations. They were not trying to get to know my soul, my passions, or my dreams. They were running a quiet, ruthless background check to see how much of a liability I might be. They were measuring the gap between my working-class roots and their manicured empire, calculating exactly how much effort it would take to mold me, silence me, and assimilate me seamlessly into the Bellamy system. Despite their obvious reservations about my pedigree, the wedding happened with astonishing, whiplash-inducing speed. The catalyst was not a sudden burst of overwhelming passion, but a catastrophic public relations crisis that nearly destroyed Adrian's position within the family company. Less than a year into our relationship, a major commercial zoning deal Adrian was spearheading for Bellamy Redevelopment Group collapsed in a spectacular, highly public fashion. Accusations of unethical environmental oversight began bleeding into the local business journals. Adrian arrived at my apartment one rainy Tuesday evening, completely unglued, pacing the floor and shaking with the raw, pathetic terror of a boy about to be punished by his father. I did not offer him empty platitudes. I did what I was trained to do. I sat him down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and spent the next 48 hours untangling the absolute mess he had made. I used my expertise in data management and operational logistics to trace the failure back to a specific, deniable bureaucratic oversight committed by a third-party contractor. I drafted a flawless, watertight response strategy that shifted the blame entirely away from Adrian and the Bellamy name. I saved his career, his reputation, and most importantly, his standing in Warren's eyes. 3 weeks later, he bought a diamond ring and asked me to marry him. At the time, I was blinded by the romantic narrative I had built in my head. I thought my competence had proven my devotion. And his proposal was a grand gesture of immense gratitude and love. Looking back through the sharp, unforgiving lens of the present, the truth is entirely different. I did not secure a husband by saving his neck. I passed an audition. I proved to the Bellamy family that I was an incredibly useful asset. I was highly capable, emotionally composed under extreme pressure, possessed a perfectly clean public record, and most crucially, I was willing to clean up Adrian's messes efficiently and quietly. The first year of our marriage systematically stripped away the remaining romantic veneer, leaving behind the cold, hard architecture of our true dynamic. I realized very quickly that the concept of a private life did not exist within that family. Warren was a constant, suffocating third presence in our home. The most horrifying revelation was witnessing the physical and psychological transformation Adrian underwent whenever his father called. The moment the phone buzzed and the screen illuminated with Warren's name, the charming, relaxed man I loved simply vanished. Adrian's spine would lock rigidly into place. His breathing would become shallow and erratic. His voice would lose all its warmth, dropping into a subservient, desperate cadence. "Yes, sir, I understand perfectly. Sir, I will have it handled immediately." He was entirely spineless, hollowed out by a lifetime of groveling for scraps of approval from a man who viewed his own children as corporate extensions. It became painfully clear that our core philosophies regarding our union were completely incompatible. I believed, with all my heart, that a marriage was a sacred partnership between two individuals standing shoulder to shoulder against the world. The Bellamys, however, viewed marriage strictly as a multi-layered family transaction, an ongoing merger designed purely to consolidate power and protect assets. They did not care if I was happy. They did not care what my favorite book was or how I liked my coffee. They only cared about the utility I provided. I was brought into their gleaming, sterile world because I was an effective shield. I was the competent, level-headed wife who made Adrian look like a responsible, settled executive to the company's shareholders. I was the reliable underling who could be trotted out at charity galas to smile and project an image of perfect, unbroken family unity. I was an employee with a wedding ring. I had spent my entire adult life taking pride in my sharp intellect and my unshakable independence. Yet, I had willingly walked right into the center of a heavily fortified prison, completely mistaking the heavy steel bars for a picket fence. As I sat in the dining room, breathing in the stifling, expensive air, the sheer magnitude of their manipulation crystallized in my mind. They had spent 4 years leading me gently by the hand, smiling warmly, all while silently locking every single door behind me. Exactly 12 months after I stood at the altar and promised to share my life with Adrian, my grandmother passed away. She was a tough, unyielding woman who had worked her hands to the bone in the dusty textile mills on the outskirts of the city, leaving behind a modest, fiercely quiet legacy. Her entire estate consisted of a few cardboard boxes filled with sepia-toned photographs, some heavily tarnished silver jewelry, and a single, surprisingly substantial piece of real estate. It was a sprawling, untamed tract of land measuring almost 11 acres, sitting squarely on the edge of the muddy river in the old Ashbrook district. For over 4 decades, that property had been nothing more than an overgrown lot housing a dilapidated brick warehouse and the rotting wooden pylons of a forgotten loading dock. It smelled of damp earth, river water, and old rust. It was gritty, entirely unpolished, and represented the exact opposite of the pristine, manicured world the Bellamys inhabited. Growing up, it was just the dusty place where my grandmother let wild blackberries grow thick along the chain-link fence. But the universe has a remarkably strange sense of timing. Less than 90 days after we buried her, the city council publicly announced a massive, multi-billion-dollar riverfront revitalization project. Almost overnight, the forgotten, industrial stretch of Ashbrook transformed into the most highly coveted commercial zoning district in the entire state. My grandmother's dusty plot of land, sitting precisely at the geographical center of the proposed cultural hub, instantly skyrocketed in value. It was the only appreciating asset my family had ever possessed. And suddenly, it was a strategic gold mine. The shift in the Bellamy household was instantaneous and chillingly calculated. Before the inheritance, Warren treated me with a polite, distant indifference, viewing me as a moderately useful appliance that kept his son grounded and their public image clean. The moment the city council approved the Ashbrook zoning permits, I was suddenly elevated to the status of a crucial business partner. Warren began having his executive assistant summon me for private, midday meals at his exclusive, oak-paneled country club. "You have to think about the broader picture, Ella," Warren said during our second lunch, slicing into a $90 steak as if he were carving up a map of the city. "An asset of that magnitude cannot just sit idle. It requires aggressive management. It requires a formidable shield. We need to focus on keeping all major assets firmly within the family structure. It is the absolute only way to ensure generational wealth and protect against external liabilities." He used the word "we" with a heavy, deliberate emphasis, completely ignoring the fact that my grandmother's sweat and blood bought that land. Not Bellamy corporate money. At home, Adrian picked up exactly where his father left off, acting as the soft-spoken, velvet-wrapped hammer to Warren's iron anvil. Adrian began weaving the topic of the Ashbrook property into our daily routines. It started during our morning coffee, then bled into our evening commutes, and finally infiltrated our bed in the dark hours of the night. "It just makes logical sense to transfer the deed into a joint family trust, Ella," Adrian murmured one evening, staring blankly at the bedroom ceiling. "It is purely for tax protection and inheritance security. We are building a life together. What is yours is mine. What is mine is yours. Let my father's wealth management team handle the heavy lifting so you do not have to worry about the legal burden." I had never once asked Adrian for financial advice. I spent 50 to 60 hours a week analyzing complex commercial data and managing operational logistics for a massive analytics firm. I knew perfectly well how to read a tax code and how to calculate property liabilities. I did not need a wealthy patriarch or his passive son to protect me from my own money. 2 weeks later, a courier arrived at my office holding a thick, heavy manila envelope sent directly from Richard Vance, the senior managing partner of the Bellamy family's personal legal team. The attached sticky note, written in Adrian's neat handwriting, read, "Just some simple administrative paperwork to get the trust rolling. Sign where flagged." I sat at my desk and opened the file. The documents were over 40 pages long. I am not a corporate attorney, but I deal with binding commercial contracts every single day. The language buried within those dense paragraphs was not simple, and it was certainly not designed to protect me. It was a vicious labyrinth of irrevocable transfer clauses and power of attorney assignments that would effectively strip me of any unilateral decision-making power regarding the Ashbrook land. I immediately packed the files into my briefcase and drove straight to the Municipal Records Building to see Marisol Kane. Marisol and I had shared a tiny, cramped dorm room in college. Surviving on cheap noodles and big ambitions, she was now a senior title clerk and property dispute specialist for the county. She knew the dirt, the zoning laws, and the hidden traps of real estate better than anyone in the city. Marisol sat in her cluttered office, meticulously reading through the 40 pages with a bright yellow highlighter in her hand. After 30 minutes, she tossed her pen onto the desk, leaned back in her chair, and crossed her arms tightly. Her expression was completely devoid of her usual warmth. "Ella, this is an absolute ambush," Marisol said, her voice dropping an octave as she tapped the highlighted clauses. "They are not trying to protect your tax liabilities. Look at this phrasing: unilateral right of encumbrance. Irrevocable asset absorption. If you sign this, You are handing the Bellamy family the absolute legal authority to leverage, mortgage, or liquidate your grandmother's property without ever needing your secondary approval. They are moving entirely too fast on an asset that does not belong to them. Do not put your pen anywhere near this document. I took her professional advice without hesitation. I began to stall. Whenever Adrian asked about the paperwork, I deflected, citing overwhelming grief over my grandmother or sheer exhaustion from my corporate job. I told them both I needed at least 6 months to process the inheritance emotionally before making any permanent, structural changes to the property deed. The moment I implemented the delay, the meticulously maintained Bellamy facade began to fracture violently. Warren's private lunch invitations ceased immediately when I attended the mandatory Sunday family dinners. He no longer offered me the expensive reserve wine. He spoke to me in clipped, irritated tones, looking at me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a stubborn, bureaucratic obstacle that was holding up his assembly line. His warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare every time I entered a room. Adrian, true to his spineless nature, found himself trapped in the crossfire. Instead of standing up to his father and defending my fundamental right to manage my own inheritance, he chose the path of least resistance. He became a relentless, whining agent of pressure, determined to break my resolve so his own life could return to a comfortable status quo. You are making things incredibly difficult for everyone, Ella, Adrian snapped one evening, pacing the length of our marble kitchen island. My father is just trying to help us optimize our portfolio. Why do you always have to be so fiercely independent and difficult? Just sign the administrative forms so we can keep the peace in the family. You are being entirely unreasonable. His insistence on keeping the peace always meant prioritizing his father's financial demands over my security. I realized then that Adrian's soft, gentle demeanor was not a sign of kindness. It was a symptom of profound, systemic cowardice. His refusal to confront Warren was a passive, yet deeply active, form of complicity. He was perfectly willing to serve me up on a silver platter just to stop his father from yelling at him over the phone. I stood my ground, keeping the original title deed locked safely in a private safety deposit box under only my name. I thought I was simply fighting a mundane battle over personal boundaries and marital respect. I thought I was just protecting a deeply sentimental piece of my family history from greedy, overbearing in-laws who wanted to control everything they touched. What I did not know during those tense, suffocating months was the catastrophic reality hiding behind the gleaming glass walls of the Bellamy redevelopment group. I did not know that Warren's crowning legacy-defining commercial project across town was bleeding cash and entirely stuck in the mud. I did not know that the family empire was teetering on the absolute edge of a massive, devastating chain of financial defaults due to reckless over-leveraging. Most importantly, I did not know that my 11 acres of dirt and broken bricks in Ashbrook was the final, desperate puzzle piece they needed to secure an emergency bridge loan. I thought I was just an annoying, defiant daughter-in-law holding on to a blue-collar family heirloom. I had absolutely no idea I was holding the only life raft that could stop their entire corporate ship from sinking straight to the bottom of the river. The first thread of their elaborate deception unraveled in late August, exactly 3 months before that suffocating holiday dinner. I was sitting at my desk at North Vale Analytics on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when a strange, automated notification popped into my personal email inbox. It was a calendar invite thanking me for confirming my attendance at a community planning symposium hosted by the Copperline Urban Renewal Office. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I had never heard of the Copperline organization in my entire life, and I certainly had not registered to attend any municipal town hall meetings. Curiosity quickly gave way to a cold, sharp prickle of alarm when I opened the attached digital document. It was a preliminary consent registry for local landowners located within the newly designated Riverfront District. Right there, near the bottom of page 4, was my full legal name, listed neatly under the consenting parties column. Beside my printed name sat a perfectly rendered digital timestamp and an electronic signature that looked terrifyingly identical to my own. I printed the document immediately, folded it into thirds, and brought it home that evening. I laid it flat on the pristine marble surface of our kitchen island, right next to the bowl where Adrian dropped his keys. When he finally walked through the door, shedding his tailored suit jacket with an exaggerated, theatrical sigh of corporate exhaustion, I tapped my index finger against the paper. "Adrian, do you happen to know anything about the Copperline Urban Renewal Office?" I asked, keeping my vocal tone entirely neutral and devoid of accusation. He froze. It was a microscopic hesitation, a tiny, unnatural rigidness in his shoulders as he reached for a glass. But after living in the same house with him for years, I knew all of his physical tells. He recovered a second later, offering a soft, dismissive laugh as he poured himself some sparkling water. "Copperline," he repeated, not meeting my eyes. "It sounds like one of those grassroots environmental groups that pop up around development zones." "Why do you ask?" "Because apparently, I electronically signed a preliminary consent form for them regarding the Ashbrook property," I stated flatly. "And since I am absolutely certain I did not sign this document, I am trying to figure out how my digital signature ended up on their municipal registry." He barely glanced at the paper on the counter. "Oh, that. It is probably just a ridiculous administrative mix-up. Ella, you know how disorganized these lower-level city clerks can be. They most likely scraped a mass mailing list from the county tax registry and auto-filled the consent column by mistake during a data migration. I will have one of the junior legal associates at my father's firm call them tomorrow morning and get it completely sorted out. Do not even waste your energy worrying about it." His dismissal was entirely too smooth, too heavily practiced. A normal husband would be outraged that someone had forged his wife's signature on a legal zoning document. Adrian just wanted the piece of paper out of his immediate line of sight. I did not let his junior associates handle it. The very next morning, I bypassed his family's firm entirely and carried the printed registry straight to Marisol. She did not brush it off as a clerical error. She locked her office door, logged into the restricted county property database using her advanced clearance, and started pulling the hidden threads. It took her less than 48 hours to drag the monster out of the dark. "Copperline is a complete ghost," Marisol told me 2 days later, her voice tight and hushed over the phone. "It is a totally fictitious entity. There is no business license, no registered agent, and no physical address. But that is not even the worst part. Ella, cancel your afternoon meetings and come down to my office right now. You need to see this paper trail in person." When I arrived at the Municipal Records Building, her desk was covered in printed, heavily redacted financial filings. She pointed a manicured finger at a highlighted routing number. "I tracked the financial accounts associated with the Copperline Domain Registry," Marisol explained, her dark eyes wide with intense concern. "They traced directly back to a corporate shell company called Ridgeway Parcel Holdings. Last month, Ridgeway secured a massive, high-interest commercial bridge loan. And do you want to take a wild guess what specific asset they used as supplemental collateral to secure that cash?" My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "My grandmother's land." Marisol nodded grimly. She slid a final, heavy sheet of paper across her desk. "They filed a temporary power of attorney assignment with the commercial lender. It grants Ridgeway the absolute legal authority to leverage the Ashbrook acreage." I stared down at the bottom of the page. There, rendered in stark black ink, was my signature. It was not a sloppy, hurried forgery. It was a masterful, meticulously practiced replication of the exact way I looped my capital letters and slashed the cross of my last name. To a rushed loan officer, or a judge glancing at a stack of exhibits, it would look perfectly authentic. But looking closely, I could see the slight, unnatural hesitation in the ink pressure, the rigid stiffness of the curves where a natural hand would flow smoothly. "This is not just a greedy family overstepping their boundaries," Marisol whispered, leaning across the desk. "This is felony criminal fraud. Someone built a deliberate paper trail. If this bridge loan defaults, and the development project blows up, the bank is going to come looking for the collateral. when the dust finally settles. The Bellamy family will simply claim they knew absolutely nothing about Ridgway. All the financial liability, all the forged consent. It all points directly back to you. They are setting you up to take the entire fall. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the betrayal threatened to knock the breath right out of my lungs. They did not just want to control my asset. They had actively framed me for a financial crime to save their own crumbling empire. Once I knew exactly what to look for. Adrian's suffocating guilt became blindingly obvious. He began treating our shared home like a hostile, dangerous territory. He claimed he was dealing with unprecedented, crushing work stress and abruptly started sleeping in the guest bedroom, citing a desperate need for uninterrupted rest. Whenever he was in the same room as me, his phone was placed firmly face down on the table. If it vibrated with a text message, he snatched it up like a starving thief. By late September, I started noticing a distinct pattern of late-night phone calls. He would slide out the heavy glass back door, pacing the stone patio in the dark, speaking in hushed, frantic whispers for an hour at a time. The final piece of their strategy fell into my lap purely by accident in early November. I was putting away a stack of dry cleaning in his closet when I noticed Adrian had left his expensive leather watch box open on his tall dresser. I reached over to snap the lid shut, but a flash of thick, cream-colored cardstock caught my eye. It was tucked neatly beneath the velvet cushion of his heavy silver chronograph. I pulled it out. The embossed gold letters caught the overhead light. It read, Harrison and Vance High Net Worth Matrimonial Law. It was the business card of a ruthless, luxury divorce attorney. Adrian had never once mentioned being unhappy in our marriage. He had never brought up marriage counseling, nor had he ever suggested a separation. Yet here he was, secretly consulting with a high-powered divorce lawyer while simultaneously sleeping down the hall and ignoring the horrific fact that his family had forged my name on fraudulent loan documents. A weaker woman might have marched down the hall, thrown the thick cardstock at his chest, and demanded a screaming, tearful confrontation. A naive woman might have called the police right then and there. But my entire career was built on operations and data logistics. I understood perfectly well that bursting into a room without a comprehensive exit strategy was a surefire way to get slaughtered. If I confronted Adrian now, he would panic. He would immediately call his father. And Warren's massive, aggressive legal machine would instantly swing into motion. They would destroy the evidence, bury the Ridgway Shell Company, and spin a public narrative that I was a hysterical, paranoid wife suffering from a severe mental breakdown. So, I swallowed my burning rage. I placed the business card exactly where I found it, down to the millimeter. I walked quietly back to my own bedroom, closed the solid oak door, and opened a secure, heavily encrypted digital folder on my personal laptop. For the next 8 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, I lived a flawless double life. By day, I was the quiet, agreeable wife, asking Adrian how his stressful days at the corporate office were going. By night, Marisol and I were quietly building a fortress. We made certified copies of the forged power of attorney. We logged the exact dates, times, and durations of Adrian's late-night patio phone calls. We cross-referenced the Ridgway registration dates with the Bellamy Company's internal fiscal calendar. We assembled every tiny, jagged piece of their conspiracy. I knew a massive storm was coming. The introduction of the divorce lawyer meant they were preparing to legally sever me from the family before the financial fallout of the bridge loan hit the public record. They needed me legally disconnected but fully, criminally liable. As the end of November approached, the air in our house grew impossibly thick and toxic. Adrian stopped looking me in the eye entirely. When the formal invitation for the grand Thanksgiving dinner arrived, written on Celeste's heavy, expensive stationery, I did not see it as a family gathering. I saw it exactly for what it was. It was a meticulously designed trap. It was the elaborate stage they had painstakingly built to force my hand, expecting me to blindly sign my own execution orders under the crushing, silent pressure of a captive audience. They thought I was walking into their snare completely blind and defenseless. They did not know I had spent the last 3 months sharpening the very blade they planned to use against me. Warren's hand remained flat on the heavy stack of legal documents after he pushed them across the polished mahogany. He looked down at me with an expression of manufactured pity, the kind a king might offer a peasant before ordering their exile. Adrian deserves a future that is not weighed down by dishonest decisions, Warren stated, his voice resonating with a sickeningly benevolent tone. He needs a partner who understands the immense weight of the Bellamy name. We are offering you a very generous exit. Ella, we simply want to close this unfortunate chapter. I kept my face perfectly blank as I looked down at the top page. I did not look at Adrian, who was now staring intensely at his half-empty wineglass, as if the dark red liquid held the secrets of the universe. I simply reached out and pulled the thick packet closer. The terms laid out on the heavy stock paper were, on the surface, incredibly generous. Section 4 offered a lump sum payment of $500,000, deposited directly into my personal account within 48 hours of signing. Section 7 guaranteed the lease on a luxury downtown apartment, fully paid for exactly 12 months. Section 9 was a standard, ironclad non-disclosure agreement, demanding absolute silence regarding all family business operations and personal matters. But it was Section 14, buried deep near the back, that revealed the true architecture of their trap. It was titled Amicable Asset Reallocation. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes easily cut through the sophisticated phrasing. It stated that, in exchange for the financial settlement, I willingly surrendered all controlling interests, deeds, and claims to the 11 acres of the Ashbrook property, retroactively validating any and all administrative actions taken by Bellamy Redevelopment Group regarding that land over the past 90 days. It was a breathtakingly audacious move. This was not a divorce decree. It was a retroactive immunity deal. They desperately needed my authentic signature on this specific document to legally legitimize the fraudulent Ridgeway Shell Company and the forged power of attorney before the massive bridge loan defaulted. If I signed this, the crime vanished. I would legally become a willing participant in their scheme, and they would walk away with my inheritance and a clean ledger. Just as my eyes reached the bottom of the page, the heavy oak dining room doors opened. Caroline, the woman in the ivory dress who had been hovering by the fireplace, was ushered to a newly placed chair right next to Adrian. Celeste gave her a tight, encouraging nod. The timing was violently deliberate. They brought her to the table at the exact moment I was reading my own execution orders, a visual battering ram designed to shatter whatever remaining self-worth they thought I possessed. She was there to show me that I was already replaced, that Adrian had found a more suitable choice who would naturally obey the family doctrine, and that fighting them was utterly pointless. I looked at Caroline. She offered me a small, sympathetic smile that felt like a slap across the face. Then, I looked at Warren. He was watching me with the breathless intensity of a predator waiting for its prey to stop twitching. They wanted a broken woman. I decided to give them one. I let out a long, shaky breath, making sure my shoulders slumped just a fraction of an inch. I reached into my purse, pulled out my silver fountain pen, and uncapped it. A collective. Silent sigh of relief swept through the grand dining room. Warren leaned back in his high-backed chair, the rigid tension leaving his shoulders. Celeste reached over and patted Adrian's arm. The sharp corporate lawyers at the end of the table exchanged brief, satisfied glances. I turned to the first signature line. I pressed the silver nib to the paper. I signed my name. I flipped the page. I signed the next one. I flipped another page, the sharp sound of the heavy paper echoing in the quiet room. I signed my name 6 different times, moving steadily through the document until I reached the final, notarized page. I signed it with a sharp, definitive flourish and set the pen down. Warren offered a tight, victorious smile. A very wise decision, Ella. The funds will be wired on Monday morning. I am glad we could resolve this like civilized adults. He reached his hand out across the mahogany table. expecting me to slide the executed documents back to him. I did not move the papers. Before we conclude the evening, a clear, sharp voice cut through the air. Every head at the table snapped toward the source. Marisol Kane pushed her antique dining chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the marble floor. She stood up, her posture impeccably straight, and reached into her dark leather designer bag. She pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Marisol did not walk over to me. She walked with slow, deliberate steps all the way to the head of the table. She stopped directly next to Warren. He looked up at her, his triumphant smile faltering, replaced by a deep, defensive scowl. "Excuse me," Warren snapped, his tone laced with venom. "This is a private family matter. You are a guest. Return to your seat immediately." Marisol ignored his command completely. She slammed the heavy envelope down onto the table, right on top of his pristine linen placemat. The sharp thud made the crystal water glasses vibrate. "Open it," Marisol ordered, her voice cold and unyielding. Warren glared at her, then looked at the lawyers, who suddenly sat up very straight. "I will do no such thing. Security will escort you out. If you do not open it and read the first page aloud right now, Warren, I will personally walk outside and hand copies of everything inside this envelope to the state banking regulators first thing on Monday morning," Marisol countered, her eyes locking onto his. "Open the envelope." The entire table was frozen. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, charged with a terrifying, unpredictable electricity. Warren's jaw locked. His face flushed with a dark, angry red, but his eyes darted to the thick manila package. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he broke the seal and pulled out the contents. He stared at the first page. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. "What is it?" Adrian asked, his voice cracking, sounding like a terrified child. Warren could not speak. He was entirely paralyzed. Since he would not speak, Marisol did it for him. She turned to face the long table, addressing the room like a prosecutor delivering an opening statement. "Inside that envelope is a certified copy of a temporary power of attorney assignment filed with a commercial lending bank," Marisol announced, her voice ringing off the vaulted ceilings. "It was used to secure a massive, high-risk bridge loan for a shell company named Ridgeway Parcel Holdings. The collateral listed for that loan is the 11-acre Ashbrook property. The signature granting that collateral authorization belongs to Ella Perez. However, a forensic document examiner has already verified that the signature is a complete, irrefutable forgery." A stunned, chaotic murmur erupted from the corporate partners. The lawyers at the end of the table physically recoiled, instantly understanding the massive criminal liability that had just been dropped onto the dining table. "But that is not all," Marisol continued, raising her voice just enough to cut through the rising panic. "Turn to the fourth page. Warren." Warren did not move, so Marisol reached down and flipped the pages herself. "This is an internal company email," Marisol stated, looking directly at Adrian. Adrian's face went entirely white. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles looked like they might shatter. "It is dated exactly 3 weeks ago," Marisol said. "It is from Adrian Bellamy, sent directly to Richard Vance, the senior managing partner of your legal team. The subject line reads, 'Risk Assessment.' The body of the email asks a very specific legal question. It asks if executing a divorce decree prior to the projected default date of the Ridgeway loan would effectively cut the criminal risk away from the Bellamy family assets." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying void. No one breathed. Caroline, the woman in the ivory dress, slowly placed her champagne flute on the table. She looked at Adrian, then at Warren, the realization dawning on her face that she had not been invited here to be a bride. She had been invited here to be a cheap, shiny distraction. She was nothing more than a prop in a criminal cover-up. Adrian looked like he was going to vomit. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I looked at the 6 pages of the divorce decree I had just signed. My signatures were bold, dark, and perfectly authentic. I rested my hands on the mahogany table, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. I did not scream. I did not throw the stack of legal papers in Warren's face. I simply looked down the length of the table, making eye contact with the man who had tried to steal my inheritance and my freedom. "It turns out," I said, my voice quiet, even, and sharper than any knife in that room, "tonight was not a dinner to kick me out of the family. It was your last attempt to escape a felony using my name." The heavy oak doors of the Bellamy estate closed behind Marisol and me with a resounding, final thud. We walked out into the freezing November night air, the gravel crunching loudly under our heels. We did not speak until we were safely inside her car and miles away from the property line. While I stared out the passenger window at the passing streetlights, I knew exactly what was happening back in that dining room. The Bellamy machine had instantly shifted from a state of shock into a desperate, high-velocity crisis mode. I could envision Warren barking orders, his face purple with rage, before midnight even struck. They had undoubtedly roused their entire fleet of defense attorneys from their beds. They were frantically drafting injunctions and cease and desist letters, trying to figure out exactly how many copies of those damning documents Marisol had made, and who she might have already shared them with. They were trying to plug a massive hole in a dam that had already violently burst. My phone began to vibrate relentlessly the second we reached the city limits. It was Adrian. Over the next 12 hours, he sent me nearly 80 text messages, his tone shifting wildly as his panic deepened. The first dozen messages were pathetic, frantic pleas for me to just answer the phone so he could explain everything. He swore there was a massive misunderstanding, that he was just trying to protect me from his father's aggressive business tactics. When I maintained absolute radio silence, his messages morphed into desperate begging for a private, face-to-face meeting at a neutral coffee shop. Just the two of us, with no lawyers present. Finally, by the time the sun came up and he realized I was not going to give him a single inch of grace, his profound cowardice curdled into vicious blame. His final message accused me of completely overreacting. He typed that I was ruthlessly turning a simple family disagreement into an all-out war and destroying the only people who had ever truly cared about me. I read that message once, locked my screen, and permanently blocked his number. Warren, however, did not waste his time sending angry text messages. He went straight for the throat. Within 48 hours of that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, Warren began actively poisoning the well. He leveraged his extensive network of high society country club members and wealthy corporate peers to spread a meticulously crafted rumor. He told anyone who would listen that the stress of a failing marriage had triggered a severe mental breakdown in me. He painted me as a deeply paranoid, hysterical woman who was fabricating wild delusions about standard property administration to extort his son. He knew a massive legal storm was brewing, and his primary strategy was to completely obliterate my credibility before I ever set foot inside a courtroom. But Warren fatally underestimated the sheer speed and brilliance of my best friend. While the Bellamy patriarch was busy whispering lies over expensive glasses of scotch at the country club, Marisol was standing in front of a county judge at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, using the forged documents and the internal bank records we had gathered. She successfully filed an emergency, temporary injunction against the entire Ashbrook parcel. The judge signed the order without hesitation. That single piece of paper acted like a brick wall slamming down onto a highway. It legally mandated that every single transaction, transfer, or loan disbursement connected to my grandmother's land had to freeze immediately. The Bellamy family could not touch a single dime of that bridge loan. I knew that surviving this required more than just defensive maneuvers. I needed someone who could go on the offensive. I immediately hired a fierce, independent civil litigation attorney named Bianca Hale. Bianca operated entirely outside the toxic sphere of the Bellamy family's influence. She did not care about their inherited wealth, their social standing, or their intimidating reputation. When I sat in her downtown office and laid the timeline of the forgery and the corporate shell company on her desk, she did not look intimidated. She looked hungry. Bianca saw this case not just as a messy divorce, but as a golden opportunity to drag a massive, systemic pattern of corporate fraud directly into the harsh light of a public courtroom. The shockwaves of Warren's vicious smear campaign inevitably breached the secure walls of Northvale Analytics. By Thursday afternoon, I was quietly summoned into a windowless conference room by the head of human resources and the chief operating officer of the firm. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. They asked me very carefully worded questions regarding my potential entanglement in a highly public, potentially criminal property scandal. The Whisper Network had done its job. My professional reputation, the single most important thing I had built with my own 2 hands long before I ever met Adrian, was suddenly hanging by a very thin, fraying thread. They were politely trying to determine if I was a liability that needed to be terminated. I refused to cower. I did not act like a victim, and I certainly did not try to hide the truth. Instead, I opened my leather briefcase and slid a comprehensive, heavily documented internal disclosure report across the table. I provided my superiors with perfectly organized copies of the forged power of attorney. The official police report I had already filed regarding the criminal identity theft, and the court-ordered injunction Marisol had secured that very morning. I looked my chief operating officer directly in the eyes and explained that I was the target of a sophisticated financial crime perpetrated by my estranged in-laws. I made it absolutely clear that I was taking aggressive, uncompromising legal action to protect my assets and neutralize the threat. Total transparency was my strongest shield. By the time I walked out of that conference room, the executives were not looking at me as a corporate liability. They understood they were looking at a woman who was fiercely, unapologetically defending her own borders. The final jarring revelation of that chaotic week arrived late Friday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing legal drafts with Bianca over the phone, when a lengthy text message popped up from an unregistered number. It was from Caroline, the blonde woman in the ivory dress who had been positioned by the fireplace. To my absolute shock, it was a raw, deeply embarrassed apology. She confessed that she had no idea what was actually happening at that dinner. She revealed that Warren had personally invited her under completely false pretenses. The patriarch had spun a tragic, fictional tale to her, claiming that I had been caught having a prolonged affair and that I was aggressively trying to extort Adrian for millions of dollars during a bitter divorce. She told me she thought she was there to provide quiet emotional support to a wronged heir, not to act as a psychological weapon in a criminal cover-up. Reading her message, a chilling realization washed over me. It exposed the absolute, terrifying depths of the Bellamy family's orchestration. They had not just prepared a single lie, they had meticulously crafted multiple, completely different versions of the truth, distributing them to specific people depending entirely on what they needed to achieve. To the lawyers, it was a simple asset reallocation. To the public, I was a paranoid, hysterical wife. To Caroline, I was a cheating, manipulative gold digger. They viewed reality as something they could endlessly mold and weaponize. But as I locked my phone and looked at the mountain of hard evidence spread across my table, I felt a cold, sharp sense of calm wash over me. Their house of cards was built on a foundation of incredibly arrogant lies, and I was holding the exact match needed to burn it all down to the ground. The surface of the conflict was dressed up as a bitter, high-stakes divorce, but as Bianca, Marisol, and I dug deeper into the heavily guarded bedrock of the Bellamy family empire. We realized we were actually excavating a rapidly collapsing tomb. My marriage was just the collateral damage of a massive, systemic financial implosion. We spent the first 2 weeks of December barricaded inside Bianca's downtown law office, drowning in a sea of subpoenaed corporate records, heavily redacted bank statements, and municipal zoning filings. Through Marisol's relentless forensic tracking and Bianca's aggressive legal demands, the polished, invincible facade of Warren's riverfront project began to shatter into a million jagged pieces. We discovered that the Bellamy Redevelopment Group was not just missing the physical deed to my 11 acres of land, They were catastrophically starved for actual cash. Warren had gambled his entire legacy on the Ashbrook district, quietly taking out two massive, high-interest, short-term loans from unregulated private lenders to keep the initial construction phases afloat. When the municipal permits were delayed, those loans began to suffocate the company. To hide the agonizing financial bleeding from their primary corporate investors, the Bellamy executives had constructed a dizzying, complex chain of subsidiary shell companies. They were essentially moving invisible money from one empty bucket to another to simulate cash flow. However, the private lenders eventually demanded a rigorous mid-year financial audit. They needed concrete proof of collateral before they would grant an extension on the repayment terms. That was exactly where my forged signature became their absolute lifeline. The fake power of attorney granting them control over my property was the sole key that allowed them to temporarily pass the lender's stringent review and avoid a total, immediate default. But the most devastating revelation did not come from the convoluted banking ledgers. It came from a digital communication log Bianca managed to pry out of the Bellamy family's external legal counsel. Up until that specific moment, I had harbored a tiny, pathetic shred of sympathy for Adrian. I had convinced myself that he was merely a weak, cowardly bystander who had been brutally bullied by his father into remaining silent while the corporate lawyers did the dirty work. I was entirely wrong. Adrian was not a victim. He was the architect of my violation. Bianca slid a printed email across her glass conference table. It was dated 4 months prior, sent directly from Adrian's personal account to Richard Vance, the senior attorney. Attached to the email was a high-resolution scan of a joint life insurance policy I had signed 3 years ago. The body of Adrian's message was brief and sickeningly casual. It contained specific instructions to extract my signature from the medical addendum and use it to execute the necessary administrative authorizations for the Ridgeway parcel transfer. He had gone into the private filing cabinet in our home office, sifted through my personal health documents, and willingly handed my identity over to a forgery specialist. The true shock of that moment had absolutely nothing to do with the money or the land. The breath left my lungs because I finally understood how Adrian truly perceived me. He did not look at me as a partner. He did not see a wife who deserved protection and loyalty. He looked at me as a convenient, recyclable asset. When his family's company needed a life raft, he simply cannibalized my identity to keep his own feet dry. As the legal pressure from our side intensified, the perfectly maintained composure of the other Bellamy family members began to rot from the inside out. Celeste, my impeccably poised mother-in-law, started showing severe, visible cracks through sworn depositions gathered from the estate's domestic staff. We learned that Celeste had been in a state of frantic, erratic panic for the entire month of November. She was not the criminal mastermind designing the fraudulent shell companies, but she was deeply, undeniably complicit. She knew Warren was operating on a terrifying, razor-thin deadline to resolve the Ashbrook property issue before the holiday lenders called in their debts. She had orchestrated the entire Thanksgiving dinner, the seating arrangements, the crystal glasses, and the presence of the blonde woman in the ivory dress, fully knowing it was a psychological slaughterhouse designed to break my mind and force my hand. Then, right in the middle of our evidence compilation, an incredibly unexpected ally walked through Bianca's office doors. It was Nolan Bellamy, Adrian's estranged younger cousin. 5 years ago, Warren had ruthlessly orchestrated a boardroom coup, pushing Nolan completely out of the family business to consolidate executive power and ensure Adrian had a clear, uncontested path to the CEO chair. Nolan had been publicly humiliated, stripped of his shares, and exiled from the inner circle. He had spent half a decade quietly waiting in the shadows for the perfect opportunity to settle his old debts. He sat down in a leather chair across from me, wearing a sharp suit and a dangerously calm smile, and placed a thick leather-bound notebook squarely on the table. "My uncle has always believed that loyalty is something you can buy and silence is something you can enforce," Nolan said, his voice smooth and cold. But he forgot that the people he stepped on to build his throne kept very detailed records. Nolan had maintained secret, encrypted communications with a handful of disgruntled junior executives still operating inside the Bellamy building. He provided us with heavily detailed minutes and verbatim transcripts from highly confidential internal strategy meetings. The notes mapped out the entire anatomy of their desperation. I opened the notebook and read a highlighted passage from a meeting that took place just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. It was a direct quote from Warren, addressing his senior partners about the escalating crisis with my property. "We execute the divorce first. We settle the land acquisition later in the ensuing chaos," Warren had dictated to the room. "The girl will be too distracted by the emotional fallout to audit the holding companies. If Adrian has to take a little hit to his personal reputation to secure the district, it is completely worth it. The family survives. That is the only metric that matters." Reading those cold, calculated words printed on the page fundamentally shifted something dark and heavy inside my chest. I finally understood the absolute truth of my situation. This was no longer a messy, isolated marital dispute. I was not fighting a husband who had fallen out of love with me. I was fighting a ruthless corporate structure masquerading as a bloodline, a place where familial affection was nothing more than a velvet cover for absolute, unyielding asset control. They traded human beings like blue-chip stocks, and for the very first time since I walked out of that grand dining room, I completely stopped hoping that Adrian would suddenly find his conscience. I stopped waiting for him to break down, call me, and offer a tearful, honest confession that could somehow magically reverse the damage and save our shared history. The email with my insurance forms and Nolan's meeting notes cured me of that pathetic delusion forever. I finally recognized Adrian's true, core nature. He was a hollow man who never took a stand based on right or wrong. He was simply a parasite who always waited to see which predator in the room was the strongest before he finally chose a side. He had bet his entire life on his father's invincible power. He had gambled my future to secure his own inheritance. But as I looked at Bianca, Marisol, and Nolan sitting around the table, surrounded by a mountain of irrefutable, damning evidence, I knew Adrian had made a fatal miscalculation. He had chosen the wrong side, and I was going to make absolutely certain he felt the full, crushing weight of that choice. I completely severed Adrian's ability to reach me. The era of his pathetic, manipulative apologies was officially over. I instructed my cellular provider to permanently block his personal number, his private office line, and every single email address registered to his name. I routed all mandatory communication directly to the heavy wooden desk of my attorney, Bianca Hale. I refused to let him weaponize our shared history. He could no longer send me late-night text messages filled with photographs of our honeymoon in Italy. Nor could he leave rambling, tearful voicemails attempting to manipulate me with half-hearted remorse. He wanted to blame me for turning a family disagreement into a war. So I decided to show him exactly what a war actually looked like. The man who had willingly handed my identity over to a forgery specialist was dead to me, and I was entirely done negotiating with a ghost. Inside Bianca's office, we transformed my raw betrayal into a cold, surgical strategy. We were no longer playing a defensive game, we were actively hunting. Bianca and I constructed a ruthless, two-pronged offensive. The first prong was an aggressive civil lawsuit designed to create a permanent, impenetrable legal fortress around the Ashbrook property, ensuring the Bellamy family could not touch a single blade of grass on that land. The second prong was far more lethal. We began quietly and selectively, leaking highly sanitized, yet deeply incriminating, fragments of financial information directly to the internal fraud investigation department of the private lending firm that had bankrolled Warren's riverfront project. We did not give them the entire puzzle. We just gave them enough blood in the water to make their senior executives start asking terrifying questions about their collateral. Marisol, operating with the clinical precision of a military strategist, delivered the most devastating blow during the second week of December. Through a quiet contact she maintained in corporate information technology, she managed to gain access to the cache memory of a leased commercial photocopier that had recently been rotated out of the main Bellamy executive suite. Deep within the machine's internal hard drive, she extracted a sequential chain of digital scans, It was the undeniable digital fingerprint of their crime. The electronic timestamp proved definitively that the forged power of attorney had been physically scanned and transmitted from the primary copy room inside the Bellamy family headquarters exactly 3 weeks prior to that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. They could no longer blame a rogue third-party contractor. The crime was committed inside their own house. Our unlikely alliance with Caroline solidified when she discovered just how expendable she truly was to the patriarch. She called my secure line on a Tuesday evening, her voice shaking with a mixture of profound embarrassment and quiet fury. Warren had filed a preliminary legal affidavit attempting to frame the Thanksgiving dinner as a calm, rational discussion about asset management that I had ruined with sudden hysteria. To my absolute disgust, he had listed Caroline's full legal name at the bottom of the document, officially citing her as an unbiased, neutral witness who could attest to my supposedly erratic behavior. He had forged her involvement just as easily as he had forged my signature, realizing she was being set up to commit perjury for a family she barely knew. Caroline drove straight to Bianca's office. She handed over every single text message and voicemail Warren had ever sent her, eagerly throwing her own match onto the gasoline. I did not want to burn the entire world down. Indiscriminate destruction is the tactic of a frightened, wounded animal, and I was entirely in control of my faculties. I meticulously targeted only the specific individuals who had actively participated in my violation. I had no interest in ruining the junior legal associates who drafted emails blindly, or the administrative assistants who simply ordered the catering. My crosshairs were locked strictly on Warren, Adrian, and the senior corporate partners who had orchestrated the fraud. I wanted my retribution to be mathematically precise, completely satisfying, and undeniably justified in the eyes of the law. I was not seeking revenge for a broken heart. I was seeking absolute accountability for a stolen identity. By the third week of December, the walls were rapidly closing in on Warren. The private lenders had officially frozen his secondary credit lines pending a full internal review, and the city council was starting to whisper about the court-ordered injunction on the riverfront project. Desperation makes arrogant men incredibly sloppy. He reached out through an intermediary, demanding a private, strictly off-the-record settlement meeting at a sterile, high-end hotel bar in the downtown district. Bianca strongly advised against it, warning me that he was a cornered predator. But I knew I needed to look him in the eye one last time. I walked into the dimly lit lounge carrying nothing but my dark leather purse. Hidden deep inside the silk lining was a high-grade digital audio recorder, fully charged and actively rolling. Warren looked 10 years older than he had at Thanksgiving. The crisp, commanding aura he usually projected was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, vibrating energy of a man watching his empire crumble. He slid a sleek silver briefcase across the polished mahogany table. He promised me $2 million. Entirely tax-free and wired to an offshore account of my choosing by Friday morning. All I had to do, he explained in a hushed, urgent tone, was sign a single piece of paper stating that my digital signature on the municipal consent forms could have been reasonably interpreted by his legal team as verbal, implied consent. He wanted me to provide him with a retroactive legal loophole. I will not sign anything, Warren, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm, refusing to break eye contact. You stole my name. You used it to commit a felony. There is absolutely no amount of money in that briefcase that buys my complicity. His face twisted into an ugly, sneering mask of pure contempt. He dropped the facade of the benevolent patriarch entirely. He leaned across the small table, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and raw panic, his eyes cold and hard. You just need to sign once to fix this minor error. Do not turn this into a moral issue, Warren hissed, every single syllable perfectly captured by the microphone hidden in my bag. You are a smart girl, Ella. Take the money and walk away before I decide to make this truly unpleasant for you. I stood up slowly, leaving the silver briefcase exactly where it was, and walked out of the hotel without looking back. When I played that crystal-clear audio file for Bianca the following morning, the brilliant lawyer actually smiled. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. She realized immediately that we were no longer just fighting for a favorable divorce settlement or a clean property title. We had handed ourselves the exact weapon needed to completely annihilate Warren's commercial reputation. We could drag him out of his shadowed boardrooms and force him into the glaring, unforgiving light of a public courtroom, exposing him not just as a cruel father-in-law, but as a desperate, predatory criminal attempting to bribe a witness. I had walked into the Bellamy family 4 years ago carrying a foolish, desperate hope that my hard work, my loyalty, and my quiet competence would eventually earn their genuine respect. I had contorted my entire personality to fit perfectly into their suffocating mold. But as I sat in that law office, listening to the audio file that would ultimately destroy the man who had tried to destroy me, I finally understood the rules of their ruthless world. I was officially done asking for a seat at their table. I was learning exactly how to make the people who had looked down on me pay the ultimate price. I was going to take the only two things they truly valued in this world, their absolute power and their pristine public image. The first official mediation session collapsed into absolute ruins after exactly 20 minutes. We sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room high above the city, the heavy mahogany table serving as the battleground. Adrian sat across from me, sweating visibly through his expensive charcoal suit, his eyes darting everywhere except toward my face. When Bianca aggressively pressed him on the fraudulent corporate filings and the forged consent forms, Adrian immediately resorted to the defense of a cornered, terrified child. He looked down at his perfectly manicured hands and quietly claimed he did not fully understand the complex legal documents he had been signing for the past 6 months. He was desperately trying to play the naive victim of his father's relentless corporate machine. Bianca did not even bother arguing with his pathetic lie. She simply reached into her leather briefcase, pulled out a small digital speaker, placed it directly in the center of the table, and pressed play. The crisp, undeniable audio of Warren's voice filled the quiet room. "You just need to sign once to fix this minor error. Do not turn this into a moral issue. You are a smart girl. Ella. Take the money and walk away before I decide to make this truly unpleasant for you." Richard Vance, the senior Bellamy attorney who had walked into the room radiating pure, condescending arrogance, physically recoiled as if he had been struck. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. He knew immediately that his client had just handed us recorded, irrefutable proof of witness tampering and near self-incrimination. Vance aggressively slapped his legal binder shut, grabbed Adrian tightly by the arm, and terminated the mediation right there on the spot. They practically ran out of the building. The fallout from that disastrous afternoon meeting pushed Adrian completely over the edge. At 2 o'clock the following morning, a frantic, heavy knocking woke me up. I had recently moved into a secure, modest apartment across town, a place completely untainted by the Bellamy name or their suffocating wealth. I checked the digital security monitor and saw Adrian standing in the poorly lit hallway. He looked completely disheveled, his tie undone, his eyes bloodshot and filled with sheer, unfiltered panic. I opened the door just a few inches, leaving the heavy brass chain firmly secured against the frame. He did not ask to come inside. He simply collapsed his weight against the doorframe and began to spill every pathetic, hidden secret he had kept from me during our entire marriage. "I am drowning. Ella," Adrian choked out, his voice cracking loudly in the quiet, empty hallway. "I am completely underwater. I made terrible, reckless investments over the past 3 years. I owe millions of dollars to private equity firms, and they were threatening to expose my massive debt to the company board. My father found out about the money. He told me he would let me go bankrupt, publicly ruin me, and strip my name from the trust entirely unless I got him the deed to the Ashbrook property. He promised to clear all my personal ledgers and save my life if I just pushed you into handing over the land." I stood in the doorway, staring blankly at the man I had shared a home with for 4 years. The revelation hit me with a sickening, heavy clarity. The most profound, agonizing betrayal of our marriage was not that he had fallen out of love with me. It was not that he wanted a divorce, or even that he had paraded Caroline around a dining room to humiliate me. The true horror was that Adrian had calculated my exact worth and decided to sell my entire life to patch the massive financial holes created by his own pathetic weakness. He was a coward who had thrown his wife directly to the wolves simply to avoid facing the consequences of his own incompetence. I did not yell. I simply looked him in the eyes, quietly closed the door in his face, and locked the heavy deadbolt. By the next afternoon, the high walls surrounding the Bellamy patriarch were rapidly collapsing from the inside. The people Warren had terrorized and controlled for decades were suddenly finding their courage in the shadow of his impending downfall. Celeste, my supposed mother-in-law, committed her very first act of true rebellion. She secretly bypassed the monitored family servers and sent a heavily encrypted email directly to my personal account. Attached was a high-resolution photograph of Warren's private, handwritten desk calendar. There, written in thick black ink on the morning immediately following Thanksgiving, was a confirmed appointment with the senior lending officers of the bridge loan firm. Celeste had given us the exact timeline. It proved definitively that the brutal public divorce spectacle at the holiday dinner was never about family dynamics or a failing marriage. It was a frantic 11th-hour runway clearing to ensure Warren could walk into the bank the very next morning with his fraud legally legitimized by my forced signature. A few hours later, Nolan Bellamy delivered his next fatal strike. He arrived at Bianca's office carrying an old, dusty hard drive he had successfully salvaged from a defunct branch office storage room. Nolan had employed a quiet data recovery specialist to strip the drive of its deleted internal files. Deep within a forgotten administrative folder, we found the preliminary, typed draft of the Thanksgiving speech Warren had delivered at the head of the table. The document was heavily edited, but one specific sentence was bolded and underlined by Warren himself. It read, "She will sign the reallocation if heavily pressured in front of a captive audience." It was premeditated psychological warfare, mapped out and scripted exactly like a ruthless military campaign. Caroline, absolutely determined to clear her own name from the impending wreckage, returned to Bianca's office to provide a formally sworn, videotaped deposition. She sat in front of the camera and stated, under strict penalty of perjury, that on the early afternoon of Thanksgiving, Celeste had personally handed her a vintage diamond and sapphire necklace to wear to the dinner. It was a famous Bellamy family heirloom, a piece of jewelry I had recognized immediately because Celeste had promised to pass it down to me when Adrian and I first married. Caroline testified that she was explicitly instructed to wear it conspicuously to create a deliberate replacement effect right in front of my eyes. A visual tactic designed specifically to break my spirit and rush my signature on the settlement papers. We had an absolute mountain of irrefutable evidence. We had the clear financial motive, the audio recording of the bribe, the forged title deeds, the internal meeting notes, the calendar schedule, and the sworn testimony of their own human props. We had more than enough ammunition to completely annihilate the public and commercial reputation of the Bellamy family empire. But Bianca and I both knew that destroying Warren's reputation was not enough to guarantee severe criminal convictions. We still lacked the ultimate killing blow. We had the email Adrian sent to the lawyers containing my insurance form. But the high-priced Bellamy defense team would undoubtedly argue that Adrian was simply forwarding routine medical paperwork and had absolutely no explicit knowledge that the lawyers intended to forge a power of attorney. We needed direct, undeniable proof of Adrian's malicious, criminal intent. We found it on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Marisol had spent the last 72 hours relentlessly attacking a secondary, cloud-based backup system tied to the main Bellamy corporate server. She was hunting for fragmented data packets, the digital ghosts of deleted communications that the executives thought they had permanently erased. While Bianca and I were reviewing Caroline's printed transcripts, Marisol suddenly slammed her hands down hard on her keyboard. She spun her laptop around so we could clearly see the glowing screen. "I found the ghost," Marisol said, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. It was a recovered, Deeply buried email chain between Adrian and the external forgery contractor secretly hired by the legal team. It was dated exactly 2 days before the fake power of attorney was officially filed with the municipal court. Adrian had not just forwarded my insurance document blindly as a clerical favor. He had attached a secondary, tightly cropped image focusing solely on my signature line. The body of the text, sent directly from Adrian's secure, personal device, consisted of a single, utterly damning sentence. Make it extremely clean. She pays close attention to details. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen, reading the words over and over again. The air in the room stood absolutely still. All the lingering pain, the deep humiliation, and the suffocating stress of the past year vanished in a single, powerful heartbeat, replaced entirely by a cold, magnificent clarity. Adrian knew. He orchestrated the forgery himself. He had actively, knowingly directed the criminal framing of his own wife to save his trust fund. With that single digital puzzle piece locked firmly into place, my entire posture shifted. I was no longer a wounded woman desperately trying to defend her family inheritance from a wealthy, overbearing dynasty. I was the executioner. I held the absolute final knife in my hand, and I was entirely ready to cleave their entire grand, pathetic charade completely in two. The true climax of my marriage did not take place over roasted turkey and expensive wine. It happened on the second Tuesday of January, precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning, inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of the City Municipal Planning Board. This was the emergency hearing demanded by the Private Lending Consortium and the Riverfront Development Council. The absolute fate of the Bellamy Empire hung entirely in the balance. Warren walked through the heavy glass doors wearing his signature tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of untouchable authority. He took his seat at the long oak table, flanked by Richard Vance and a team of junior legal associates. Warren genuinely believed he could contain this explosion. He intended to spin the entire disaster as a bitter, emotionally charged marital dispute over routine asset management, something completely divorced from his company's operational integrity. Bianca Hale sat beside me, her posture perfectly straight. She did not waste time with opening pleasantries. When the lead arbitrator asked for our statement regarding the contested property title, Bianca simply opened her thick leather briefcase and began dealing our evidence onto the table like a lethal deck of cards. First, she submitted the certified municipal land records proving my sole ownership. Next, she slid over the digital log extracted directly from the Bellamy corporate scanner, complete with date and timestamps. Then came the printed email from Adrian regarding my medical records, followed immediately by a certified transcript of the audio recording where Warren explicitly offered me a multi-million-dollar bribe to fix a minor error. Bianca finished her initial assault by presenting Caroline's sworn affidavit and the photograph of Warren's private calendar provided by Celeste. The representatives from the lending firm stared at the documents, their faces turning the color of wet concrete. The head of the city council adjusted his glasses, completely speechless. Richard Vance, sweating profusely under the harsh lights, attempted a desperate, pathetic defense. These documents prove nothing but a series of unfortunate administrative errors, Vance stammered, adjusting his silk tie. My clients operate a massive development firm. Clerical mistakes happen. The plaintiff is simply weaponizing a standard miscommunication to extort a higher divorce settlement. That was the exact moment Marisol leaned forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed one final piece of paper directly in front of the lead lending officer. There is absolutely no miscommunication here, Marisol stated clearly. This is a recovered internal email sent by Adrian Bellamy to his external forgery contractor exactly 48 hours before the fraudulent power of attorney was filed. He attached a cropped image of Ella's signature. His exact written instruction was to make it extremely clean because she pays close attention to details. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a billion-dollar legacy dying on the vine. Adrian physically crumbled. The rigid posture he had maintained all morning vanished. He dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking, when the arbitrator asked him directly if the email was authentic. Adrian did not look at his father. He did not look at his lawyer. He stared at the polished wood of the table. "Yes," Adrian whispered, his voice entirely broken. "I sent it. I knew about the plan. Thanksgiving was just a setup. We needed her to sign the settlement to cover up the forgery before the bank audit. I am so sorry." Warren erupted. The immaculate, controlled patriarch completely shattered. He shot out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the carpeted floor. He turned on his own son, his face a mask of purple, venomous rage. "You absolute fool!" Warren screamed, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "You pathetic, weak liability! I built this empire with my bare hands, and you throw it away because you cannot hold your nerve in a boardroom." It was a grotesque, magnificent spectacle. In front of the city officials, his primary financial backers, and his own legal team. Warren exposed the vicious, rotting core of his character. He was not a respected community leader. He was a ruthless tyrant furious that his human shield had finally dropped. The execution was swift and merciless. Before we even left the building, the private lending consortium officially froze every single cent of the Bellamy Redevelopment Group's funding. The City Council formally voted to revoke their primary contractor status for the Riverfront Revitalization Project. By noon, the massive file of our compiled evidence was physically handed over to the district attorney's office to initiate a sweeping criminal fraud investigation. The subsequent civil proceedings were a complete massacre. I retained absolute, uncontested ownership of the 11 acres in Ashbrook. The divorce decree was finalized exactly on my terms, stripping Adrian of any right to my current or future assets. To avoid serving a severe, multi-year sentence in a state penitentiary for his direct role in the forgery, Adrian was forced to sign a comprehensive, legally binding confession, securing his cooperation with the federal investigators currently tearing his father's company apart. Months later, the dust finally settled. Major commercial developers began circling my property like hungry sharks, offering me tens of millions of dollars for the empty dirt. I rejected every single bid. I did not want to replace one greedy corporate machine with another. Instead, I formed a joint partnership with a small, highly ethical local development collective. We drafted plans to transform the riverfront lot into a vibrant, accessible community commercial center. It would feature small business incubators, open green spaces, and a public market. We named the entire complex after my grandmother. It would not be a towering, intimidating skyscraper made of cold glass and steel. It would be grounded, honest, and completely clean. It finally belonged to the right people. On a quiet Thursday afternoon in late December, exactly 1 year after my marriage violently collapsed, I drove out to the Ashbrook property. The air was biting and cold, the sky a pale, clear winter blue. I stood alone on the muddy bank of the river, listening to the water rush against the old, rotting wooden pylons. I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out the original manila folder that Adrian had sent to my office, the one containing the fraudulent trust documents that were meant to quietly bury me. I held the thick paper in my gloved hands, feeling the weight of the lies they had tried to chain me to. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel any lingering sorrow for the man I used to love, or the family I had tried so desperately to please. I looked out over the wild, untamed land that my grandmother had left me. I realized then that the Bellamy family had never actually possessed the power to destroy me. By forcing my hand, they had simply given me the exact tools I needed to dismantle them. The only thing that truly died at that Thanksgiving table was the arrogant illusion that anyone, no matter how wealthy or powerful, had the right to write my fate for me. I was the author of my own life now, and the pages ahead were entirely mine to fill. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and inspire even more people.